Thank you, Kathleen. And thank you to all of you for the terrific work that you are doing. I want to congratulate all of the award recipients tonight, but it is a particular privilege and pleasure for me to be here to introduce the award to Paul Polman. That's a lot of P's in a sentence, I know. But before I get to how terrific he is and how terrific Unilever is, I've got to set the scene a little bit. And the scene setter is fairly simple. Climate change is going to have dramatic impacts on the natural world that we live in. It's going to move things around, it's going to change crops, it's going to change temperatures, it's going to cause forest fires and droughts and weather. Sea levels will rise, there'll be flooding along coasts. The consequences are going to be fairly dramatic. That's the first order of damage. The second order of damage is that when all that happens, people have to react. They have to move around away from the flood. They have to abandon areas where the crop they've grown for generations is no longer good. They have to pursue fisheries that have moved toward the poles in search of cooler water. And all of that will create what the Department of Defense regularly calls a catalyst for conflict. So there will be that human suffering that follows from nature's own suffering. But then there's a third order of damage from climate change, and that is that all of that suffering and all of that dislocation will befall a great number of people. And whether it's Tom Friedman or Pope Francis or the United States Department of Defense, that suffering has been well recognized already, the prospect of all that suffering. And one of the things about the human condition is that when we suffer, we want answers and we want justice. Since the end of World War II, it has more or less been the American century, with American leadership driving the direction of the world. And the two pillars of that have been open democracy and market capitalism. Open democracy and market capitalism will suffer if they can't deliver an answer on climate change. When people living at the subsistence level in countries all around the world are facing that suffering, they will ask the question, why did this happen? And America's rivals, the rivals of open democracy, the rivals of market capitalism around the world will have a ready answer, which is that you can't trust open democracy and you can't trust market capitalism. Just look at how they failed on climate change. Just look at how they failed despite decades of notice from scientists, from big companies, from the Defense Department, from so many others. Look how they failed. And why did they fail? They failed because they couldn't get the job done because that vaunted American democracy was so corrupted by fossil fuel interests and dark money that they couldn't do their job. That is a terrible, terrible reckoning for us to have to face. Against that context, I can tell you I have 6 to 10 Republican colleagues in the United States Senate who would like to get to work on a climate bill right now. They see the pressure, they understand the importance, and they believe what Secretaries Paulson and Schultz and Baker all told them, which is the Republican Party has to get this right or it's going to be tainted for a generation by its failure. So they're ready. And some of them are extremely brave. Some of them are demonstrably brave. John McCain campaigned on climate change when he ran for president, and he is probably the demonstrably bravest individual I know. He is willing to get into a fight, and so are many other Republican senators, but they're not willing to undertake a suicide mission. And at the moment, what they see when they look around the corporate sector, which is their natural constituency, is a fossil fuel industry that says, cross us and we will have your head. And nobody on the other side saying, do the right thing and we will have your back. Just a week ago, TechNet, the lobby group for Silicon Valley, which has monsters like Apple and Google and Microsoft and Facebook in it, and which has about a quarter of its membership actually in the green energy space, Solar City, Bloom Energy, Sunrun, and companies like that, they came in to lobby us and they gave us their list of priorities. Clean energy wasn't even a priority of theirs, let alone climate change. If a group that represents that big a section of the American economy, that is that powerful to withstand special interest pressure, and is that directly invested in clean energy, can't stand up and say, this is an issue, we're going to lobby on this, who do they think is going to do this? A year ago they came and they said the same thing and they did nothing, and they came the same week as the lumber and the timber industry. Anybody heard of the pine beetle? Anybody know what's happening to the deciduous forests as the world warms and to fires in forests? The lumber and timber industry had its own list of priorities when they came. Climate change was never mentioned. And in the same week, this really blew me out because it was all in the same week. In the same week, the property, casualty, and insurance industry came in to lobby Congress. They write the checks when nature goes haywire. Climate change was not even on their list. The silence in Congress from corporate America is deafening. And it is against that background that we see Unilever, and Paul specifically, as the most energetic, the most determined, and the bravest entity that is trying to move that group together. Yes, absolutely. If they can rebuild the corporate group that supported President Obama on the Paris Agreement, and simply, rather than breaking up that band, turn it to Congress and say, go. Tell them that if they do the right thing, you'll have their back. The fossil fuel industry isn't unbeatable. You just need offsetting pressure in the hydraulics of congressional political pressure. And a group like that could make it happen. So it's leadership like Paul's to assemble that group, which is patient, because everybody's cautious and doesn't want to get out too far and fears retribution and worries about what other issues they need to be concerned about. But the relentless and persistent belief in this from Paul Polman and from Unilever, gathering, first of all, the food businesses together, which is the strongest group because of Unilever's leadership, gathering in recent letters to the president, in recent advertisements, in newspapers, in constant pressure, showing leadership from America's corporate community. This is going to be the breakthrough moment when they get together in enough mass that that group of 6 to 10 Republicans says, okay, now's our moment. Let's have this fight. It's not a suicide mission any longer. So just a quick word beyond that, because Unilever is great on a lot of stuff. Out of the Fortune Global 500, it's number 147. It operates in more than 100 different countries with sales in 190 countries. It has 400 different brands. The one that is most meaningful to me, of course, is Ben & Jerry's. It has 2.5 billion customers, most of them, I hope, eating Ben & Jerry's. It's among the top 50 most admired companies in the world, and for good reason, because it sets an example of moral corporate leadership, not just within its fence, but also out its supply chain. And as I've said, also now trying to engage the corporate community more robustly in Congress, where they can make such a difference. He has called for what he calls a better form of capitalism. And when you consider the threat to market capitalism of getting climate change wrong and having that global blowback against the system that allowed this to happen, focusing on market capitalism, he is not kidding when he has this passion for a better form of capitalism. Moral leadership, Paul has said, is an integral part of the way we run our business. And wow, that matters. Thank you, Paul. Congratulations. Very proud of you.
Thank you, Sheldon, and thank you for being here, everybody. I was actually very touched that you took the time out because it's a busy day. We just had some meetings before and trying to make use of the time here in Washington, and I know what you're doing. He probably has to leave now, so we will apologize him, but if you have to do your duties, don't worry. We'll see you soon. Thanks. I think he deserves an applause, actually. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that. The only thing I can say is he probably fired him too late, but anyway. I'm just a simple Dutchman here. I was just being told that for climate change, in fact, Sheldon and I met at Paris when we were working on the COP21 agreement with some tremendous work from everybody in on this planet. Never seen such an outcry from civil society, from organizations like yourselves, from business actually as well, and frankly we got a fairly decent agreement as a first step, and we have to work very hard to be sure that that is not being unraveled as we stand here. And the first step, obviously, that we need to do is absolutely an imperative, is to keep the US in the Paris agreements. And fortunately, we have a chance tomorrow morning to talk to the White House and see what we can do to at least make our points clear. But I'm very encouraged by the many people rallying again to ensure that you don't go out. It would be a tragedy for the US, not only for your own economy and for the functioning of your economy, but also for your standing overseas, where you have more influence than sometimes you realize. So it's in our self-interest, I think, and the ones for our children. I was just told this evening, coming here, that at the time of the COP21, we introduced the Ben & Jerry's ice cream, which was called Save Our Swirl. And we went around the world, the US in Teslas and, Toyota Priuses, I guess, but trying to convince everybody and create the awareness on the Paris Agreement. Tonight I've been told actually that we've introduced a new ice cream which is called Impeach Trump. So this, I can only tell you, it shows you how independently we let Ben & Jerry's run their operations. In fact, by the time we acquired them, we have this Ben & Jerry's Foundation, and part of our turnover goes to the Ben & Jerry Foundation, and then the wonderful people of Ben & Jerry's can decide what they want to do with that money. And I found out when I became CEO about 9 years ago that one of the causes is actually to fight multinationals. So I can stand here honestly in front of you and say that I'm the only CEO of a multinational who's financing his own demise. But anyway, Nora, congratulations on your recognition and what you're doing for the food movement, because we definitely have to move it from calories to nutrition, and I think that's really what you were trying to do. Happy to tell you that Hellmann's has an organic version, so when we get to your restaurant next time, I want to see Hellmann's there. But certainly appreciate that, and well-deserved recognition. And Kathleen as well, the Earth Day is very well known to us. It's actually Rachel Carson wrote her book Silent Spring in 1962, and only a few years later, nearly 50 years ago now for you as well, your celebrations, you came out with the Earth Day movement, and having 1 billion people now around the world rally. I remember my kids in overseas schools, we always moved around working on Earth Day and coming home with their projects and their papers and all the other things. And now doing the same with science, because most of the things we do, we have to be sure it's science-based, and that we don't lose that. Again, another thing that's under threat is what we currently face, and you bring the attention to that. I've always been fascinated by how you get a movement of 1 billion people. There's not really that easy. We sell brands to about 2.5 billion people every day, and we are trying to reach another billion people, improving their health and well-being as part of our plans. And we just know what it takes and how difficult that is to do. But at the end of the day, changing the world and driving the force for good that we're all looking for, you can only do that if you empower the citizens of this world, and that's exactly what you're doing with your organization, which I think will only be more relevant in the future. So I'm very proud of what you're doing there. Your Earth Day founder, Gayford Nelson, or he was also a senator, I guess, said that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of nature, not the other way around. And I think he said it very well already then. In fact, if you look at the relationship between the economy and the nature, it's actually very clear from the Greek roots again. If you look at ecology and economy, the oikos, which is really home or domain in Greek, and then you look at oikos nomos, which is really how we choose to manage our shared economy. Oikos nomos is really the economy part. And then oikos logos is actually meaning of the natural bounty, or what we have, what we call our natural home, which is then ecology. So these two things are basically two sides of the same coin. I'm always remind people of Hubert Reeves, that he is a philosopher from Canada. And in one of his books he said something that struck me, that said man is actually the most insane species. He worships an invisible God and destroys a visible nature, not realizing that the visible nature he destroys is the invisible God he worships in the first place. And I think that is really what we are doing at this moment. We're living at a very challenging time for anybody, there's no question about it. The financial crisis of 2006, 2007 brought even home more than anything that we are living in a system that undoubtedly has created enormous amounts of wealth and lifted enormous amounts of people out of poverty. In fact, in the last 50 years or so, we have lifted more people out of poverty than any time in the history of mankind. Maternal health is better, more women are in education, people live longer, it's more people are going to bed with at least some food in their stomachs. And so it's very clear that if you look at this, we've made great progress. In fact, when Kofi Annan started the Millennial Development Goals in the year 2000, it had as objective to halve the number of people living in poverty. And lo and behold, 15 years later, 2015, we actually achieved that. Now, a lot of people will say it's China, but it was more than that. And at that time, poverty was defined as living on $1.25 a day. So it's not that much. Now we're moving into the period of the Sustainable Development Goals, which really are covering the period 2015 to 2030. And we have a unique opportunity, in my opinion, to belong to that generation that once and for all can irreversibly eradicate poverty and do this in a more sustainable and equitable way. And the good thing with these Sustainable Development Goals is that it now are universal goals. It's a goal about people, it's a goal about planet, it's a goal about peace, it's a goal about prosperity, but above all a goal about partnership. It's very clear to me that the challenges that we're facing can just not be solved anymore if we continue to do the same thing over and over again. It was Einstein who said the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over and expect different results. It's just not going to happen anymore. So these enormous challenges that we have, as well captured in the Sustainable Development Goal, requires a different type of partnership. And it's not just a partnership or you and I working together or signing a contract. It's really a partnership of humanity as far as I'm concerned. And for humanity to function at the end of the day, we need to first and foremost operate with a higher level of respect and dignity for our fellow human beings. It's 99.999% that unites us across the world. But if you read the newspapers, you think that we have more differences than we could ever handle. We should celebrate our commonalities with that respect and dignity. The second thing is obviously to be sure that we give and invest in the communities in which we live. If we give some people said that greed might be good, but giving is actually better. And what we have found out also in Unilever is to just continue to invest in these communities around us will pay back handsomely at any time, and is good for business as we see it. And the third thing is really to think intergenerational. If this planet is about 4.5 billion years old, then what gives us the right in the last less than 200 years, I would even say the last 50 years, to do more damage on this planet Earth than anybody has done before us in these 4.5 billion years that we've been around. It's actually, to me, quite striking. So if we don't start to think intergenerational in what we do, I don't think we will solve it. My wife just wrote a very simple book that she felt many people had forgotten about, which is really the golden rule: do unto others as you want to have done unto yourselves. You find it in Confucianism, you find it in Islam, you find it in the Jewish religion, you find it in the Christian religions. It actually permeates all of it, and probably captures very well how we should function in all we do. And if we would live that rule, in my opinion, in anything that we can influence, this world would be a significantly better place. I wanted to say to Sheldon that it's not an easy time to be a politician, certainly not in the US, but he's no exception here. It is the case in most places in the world. We're coming to a point that several forces are coming together that probably have never been together, and it's difficult to navigate these choppy waters. We have a world that has rapidly changed in terms of centers of gravity to the south and to the east. And the development of China would be an example of that. And that's a tremendously good thing, lifting these people out of poverty, as I said before. But what we haven't adjusted to this changing power field is the global governance. Most of our institutions in which we run the world are still the institutions from Bretton Woods, the 1944 institutions. And frankly, many of the issues that we face now, the issues of climate change or the financial markets or our tax systems globally, if you want to, or even issues of security that you see now, much of that related to climate change, by the way, are of international nature, and they need to be solved by sitting around the table. And we haven't really figured out the right bodies to do that. Most of these bodies, like the World Bank or the IMF or the OECD, if you want to, or even the Security Council and many other things, where when 80 or 90% of the world economy was located in Europe and the US. So if we don't adjust that and adapt that, I think we'll have a problem. And that is really a vacuum that you now see. The second thing is that by lifting so many people out of poverty, which has been great news, but we've done it in a way that is non-sustainable, and that's obviously our linear consumption model. We think that it's a very good thing to dig a hole in the earth and produce something out of it, and then ditch it into landfills or into oceans, to the extent even that in 30 years you'll have more plastic in the oceans than fish if we don't intervene. And obviously, how long can we dig before we end up in Australia? It's not a good thing. We have to move to this circular economy concept, and that puts an enormous pressure on the world. Johan Rockström, who runs the Stockholm Resilience Institute, talks about 9 planetary boundaries that define the health of this world. And actually 4 of these planetary boundaries, climate change being one of them, obviously well exceeds the minimum requirements that we can handle. So we are playing around with Mother Nature, and in the battle with Mother Nature is not going to lose. WWF is here tonight, and in fact they estimate in their latest studies that half of the living species or wild species will disappear by 2020, already under the current trajectory, which is an outright tragedy, realizing that we are probably one of the species, so it's a matter of time before it gets to us, but we don't seem to realize that it's not really a battle between man and nature, if you want to, because in that battle nature will clearly win. And the third challenge that we have is an economic system that increasingly we became aware in the financial crisis that it is a system that works increasingly for a few people, but not for everybody. When you have now 8 people that have the same net wealth as the bottom 3.5 billion people, or if you have about 60, 70 people which fit in a double-decker bus in London that have the same wealth as the other 99% of the population, it's not going to work. Any system where too many people feel they're not participating or are excluded ultimately will rebel against itself. And I think what I like about the Sustainable Development Goals, these famous 17 goals, is probably the best opportunity we have in terms of a moral framework to attack that. Obviously, with global governance not working, getting 193 countries at the UN in September of 2015 to sign this agreement and say we are committed to doing that is a tremendous achievement. And it's also a tremendous opportunity for business to get involved. The 800 million people that go to bed hungry every day and not knowing if they wake up the next day are a tremendous opportunity if you would be in the food business. The 2.5 billion people that need access to energy is a tremendous opportunity if you can provide that in a sustainable way, and increasingly we're able to do that. The untapped potential of women in this world, probably the most discriminated group in the world still, just investing in them is a tremendous opportunity to grow this global economy. And you can look at any of these goals and see them either as threats or scorecards of failings, or you can see them as enormous opportunities, and that is obviously what we like to do. I'm not too much interested in Unilever, to be honest, standing here, because I think the issues that we need to solve are bigger than Unilever. But we made a commitment in 2009 when we introduced the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan to totally decouple our growth from environmental impact and to increase our overall social impact. So it really goes to the triple bottom line of economical. You want to survive, obviously, and that's part of being a sustainable model, but also doing this environmentally and socially right. And I don't think there's any question why that should be our objective. What is different for us versus other companies that we see, certainly of our scale and size, is that we take responsibility across the total value chain, from farm to fork. We don't think that it is right by outsourcing part of your supply chain that you also outsource your responsibilities. You cannot really do that. And for us, it permeates all of our brands and obviously all of our operations, that we set some audacious goals of reaching 1 billion people, improving their health and well-being. 4 million children die every year just unnecessarily because of infectious diseases, diarrhea, pneumonia. With a simple act of hand washing, you can actually bring that down by 75%. And it could be our children. 1.5 billion people still have no access to toilets, with all the issues involved in that, of open defecation, and it could have been us. Many people, especially women again, over 4 million don't even have access to education yet. And again, we're standing here because we had that access, but it could have been us. So if we don't create this world that is a little bit more inclusive and build that into all of our business plans, we don't have any reason for being, I believe. And business cannot simply be a bystander in a system that gives them life in the first place. We have to be active participants, first of all, to help de-risk the political process when it's a little difficult time right now, but also to show what the real purpose of business is here. And the real purpose of business, obviously, is to attack these social problems, to provide solutions, and to create a world that is better. That has always been the origin of business. That has always been the purpose of business. But I think over the last decades, we've lost some of that. I talk to so many CEOs and I ask, what's your purpose? And if they have a hard time verbalizing it, I get a little bit nervous. Usually they have something about shareholders, but that just cannot be the purpose. But what you see in the US now, when I was born in 1956, the average length of a publicly traded company was 67 years that company would be around. Now it has dropped to 17 years. If we run these companies just simply for the shareholders and increasingly shorter and shorter term oriented, then obviously the result is that you run it into the ground. A business that doesn't have a purpose doesn't have any purpose for being here. And increasingly the citizens of this world vote them out of business. So coming to climate change for me is not just climate change, and in fact we should have framed this long ago already quite differently, because at the end of the day, climate change is a development agenda. What interests me most is it's that the poor of this world, the poor in this world, and often the poorest of the poorest that suffer. We actually are not galvanized into action with the speed that we need, because we are not really too much affected by climate change. We live in areas that are fairly resilient. We are financially fairly well off. We are in a fairly small cocoon versus the rest of this world. But anything that is happening now, that in 80% of the world, which we still call conveniently the developing markets, the story is quite different, and these people are desperately looking for solutions. And we will not be able to solve any of these other development goals if we don't tackle what is called number 13 which is climate action. And that's why it's important that we see increasingly this as a development agenda. In the US, unfortunately, it has become politicized for reasons unknown to me over the last few years, actually, unfortunately. But human development and providing equal opportunities for everybody should not be an issue for the left or the right. This is an issue for humanity, for all of us, irrespective of your political color. So it's no question that we must attack this and that time is running out. And as one of your, in fact, who started your post office here, which was Benjamin Franklin, who said that you may delay, but time will not, and lost time will never be found again. I think we're a little bit in that moment now. The world knows where we have to go. The world is actually committed to move in that direction. I think Paris clearly showed us. In the same year, by the way, as we signed the Sustainable Development Goals, we had the COP21, and the world said we're going to eradicate poverty, and Paris said we're going to decarbonize this global economy. The issue is not the direction, the issue is the speed of it. And we need to work very hard to ensure that we keep the right speed. On climate change, that means really that we need to peak in 2020. If we don't peak in 2020, the numbers frankly don't add up. And if you go above the 2 degrees, the effects will be quite significant. Many insurance companies would not want to be in that business anymore if you deal with that. And currently we're still on a trajectory. The curve of 4 degrees was bent to about 2.7 degrees in Paris, but there's still a lot more work to do. And we're on the verge of having to recommit what we did in Paris. This agreement was a very smart agreement where everybody came with their own INDCs at that time, now called NDCs, nationally determined commitments. And it included therefore everybody. In fact, the only 2 countries that were not included still now today are Nicaragua and Syria, but everybody else has signed up to Paris. But there was a commitment to no backsliding and a commitment to renegotiate in 2018. We have the famous meeting coming up in California then, and it is important that we rally all the countries of this world to set their ambitions higher, to stay well below the 2 degrees. What we do with the business community is equally important to us for a simple reason that you cannot achieve, obviously, these targets if the private sector doesn't get actively involved. To make these sustainable development goals come alive will require about $3 to $4 trillion a year, which, by the way, is not much on a global economy of about $100 trillion. But the overseas development aid of all countries, and unfortunately you're going into the wrong direction on that, but the overseas development aid is only about 160 billion. So 2 to 3 trillion, or 3 to 4 trillion, wherever you want to put the development goals, investments, with 160 billion ODA doesn't work. So it has to come from the private sector. The private sector currently is 60% of the global GDP, about 80% of the financing and 90% of the job creation. That's why it's so important that we do all of this together. That's obviously what we are trying to do in Unilever and try to bring the right coalitions together. I'm of the opinion that it doesn't need many people, it just needs the right people to create these tipping points. A good example where we have done that is, for example, on palm oil or deforestation, where we obviously have an enormous issue in the speed with which we cut down the forests of this world. But we got the global consumer goods companies together, about 3 to 4 trillion of industry in terms of turnover, to commit that by 2020 nothing will be sold anymore that comes from what I call illegal deforestation. Things like palm oil or soy or beef are obviously key drivers of that. That's a big impact in climate change. Andrew Steer is here with an initiative 12.3, goal number 12 on the Sustainable Development Goals is responsible consumption. Goal number 12.3 deals with food waste. If food waste was a country, by the way, it would be the 3rd biggest carbon emitter in this world after China and the US. So cutting food waste in half or more is a great initiative, and we're rallying again the global consumer goods industry behind that. We've moved the industry to natural refrigerants on ice cream cabinets or the Coke and Pepsi cabinets and all the other things that your daughter doesn't drink anymore. So I'm wondering why we do this in the first place, listening to you. But if you do that and you move that industry out of that, that's another 2 or 3% of global warming. Moving to climate smart agriculture, equally important. We have a situation still that we produce, we waste, we don't feed the right people, we create obesity on the other end. Our food value chain is broken. So starting a big initiative on forest and land use to really get to what we might call conveniently climate smart agriculture, and doing that in a way that we also employ people and create jobs for smallholder farmers. One of the bigger challenges will be of the fourth industrial revolution coming up with the Internet of Things and artificial intelligence and all the other things, that we are probably going to destroy quite a lot of jobs if we like it or not. So thinking about all these things from a development point of view also means a human inclusion point of view in creating these jobs. I'm actually fairly optimistic, believe it or not, for one reason, that it's too late to be a pessimist. But more importantly, there are some good things happening that we should really rally around and think around. The first one are the millennials. The millennials are different. I have 3 boys, and they are millennials, and they are more purpose-driven than we probably have realized until now. So leveraging these youth networks, giving them a voice at the table. These were the same people, by the way, where 75% voted to stay in Europe, and yet we're ending up with Brexit. These are the same people. If you look at the US, only one state would have been red and the rest would have been blue. But we have to get them out and have to involve them in the political process and empower them, make them part of all the decisions. But getting the young people there, in most of the efforts we're involved in, it's young people that are actually driving that change. And again, the more we can create these future leaders amongst them, the better we're off. The second reason I'm optimistic is increasingly we live in the age of transparency. There's many things on the internet that we might like or not like, but the one thing it does do is transparency. And it's nearly every day or every week that you open the newspaper and you see again one or another institution, be it a government or be it an NGO or be it a business, and increasingly businesses that are being caught with their pens down for doing something that consumers don't accept anymore. They don't accept a Rana Plaza factory where 1,150 women unnecessarily lose their lives because we think it's so cool to buy a $1 t-shirt. They don't accept anymore that we manipulate LIBOR rates or foreign exchange rates, or that we cut corners on maintenance and have a well explode, or that we sell horse meat for beef, or that we treat people differently in the value chain than we expect to be treated ourselves. So enormous transparency, and transparency drives trust, and trust ultimately drives that prosperity. And then the third thing why I'm optimistic is that we are actually getting to the point that the cost of not acting is starting to be higher than the cost of acting. Which, if you don't have a moral compass, or what Bill George calls a true north, fine, we might have our judgments for those people, but at the end of the day, these people will be driven by the sheer numbers, and that's obviously when the cost of not acting is becoming higher than the cost of acting, then you're at a tipping point. And what you see on climate change, you actually see that happening. We have $34 trillion of money under management in the financial world calling for a price on carbon. The divestiture movement, which we thought would be 500 billion in Paris, ended up nearly being 1 billion, has now become 5.3 trillion. So that's happening. We see more and more companies taking an internal price on carbon, including ourselves. There are over 1,000 companies with an internal price on carbon. And the US actually, with the Schultz, Baker, and Polman proposal, there might be some meat in there that we get the US as well. As you know, China is moving this year to a global carbon pricing system, which means that we will have about 23% of the world on carbon pricing, including in this country, by the way, California. And anywhere where we look at it, it not only accelerates that conversion, but it actually makes good economic sense. The regions that have done that, or the countries that have done that, have actually prospered from that economically as well, and are a step ahead, I think, of many of the other regions. So there are many good things, I think, happening right now that give us the encouragement. But again, I want to come back to that final point I mentioned. It is really the speed with which we need to be moving. And whilst we are honored for all the people in Unilever to accept your recognition, and we recognize you more for what you're doing, all of you here, I'm always a little bit hesitant to take these recognitions, because I firmly believe that reputation is not made by what we say, but obviously made by what we do. And in this area, we still have a lot to do. So although we gracefully accept the reward, I rather have these awards when we have eradicated poverty and when we have dealt with the issue of climate change, so none of the future generations has to deal with that anymore. Thank you very much.